joined now by Dr. Alfred Dawes. And you had said earlier, Dr. Dawes, we appreciate you talking to us. You had said earlier that you do welcome the responses you've heard from the PM in particular.
Hi, good evening, and good evening to all the listeners. Hello?
Yes, hearing you now, Dr. Dawes. I was saying you said at your press conference earlier that you welcomed the response you've heard so far from the PM in particular, I think.
Well, we do need an audit because the numbers that were a part of the Ministry of Health release are incorrect, or they can't be substantiated by corroborating that release with other declarations coming out of press conferences or utterances from, coming out of the Ministry of Health. We have several different numbers that we're looking at in one press conference to update the country on the state of readiness for COVID. We saw 105 ventilators. The first press release that came out, when you check up everything that was added, that was when they gave the locations of all the ventilators, the number was 54, and this is including the university hospital, which is not a part of the public health system, so it's even less. And then we are seeing another report coming out that it is actually 122 with only 15% down. Now, I am reliably informed that the numbers of ventilators that are working is far below what has been put out by the Ministry of Health. And the truth is that a lot of them are in need of repair, or they have been cannibalized to take parts from them to repair other ventilators to keep them working. Now, the numbers have changed so much that I don't know if by the time an audit is done, we would have seen more ventilators being commissioned, because there are some of them in boxes. But what can be said is that the staff in the hospitals who are working, they know exactly how many ventilators are working today, June 19th. And I can tell you that at KPH, it is less than 10. At Cornwall, it is less than 10. And those are the two biggest hospitals in Jamaica.
Hold that thought for me one moment, Dr. Dawes. Let me just take the break, do a little bit of business, and we come back. You're listening to Dr. Alfred Dawes. He's opposition spokesperson on health and wellness, talking to us about questions he's raising about the existence and functioning of ventilators in the public health system. Thank you so much for staying with us. We continue with you on Beyond the Headlines. I'm Dion Jackson, and I'll say, on a noting, I'm the pothole queen, not true. Mega get 1 million pothole. Dion, fix a one here. Dion, make them fix. Look, we'll invite the Works Agency to come in for a pothole day, all right? Whether I will, Stephen Shaw is hearing me and turning off his phone as I speak. We'll invite them to come and sit, and we'll see if we can get, because they usually have an idea of when they're going to be patching where. So let's see if we can do that, maybe one day next week. All right, listeners? All right, so we're back with Dr. Alfred Dawes, opposition spokesperson on health and wellness, talking about the issue with ventilators in the public health system. So this report that the health minister says is going to be produced, and we hear the PM talk about an investigation. So tell me exactly what you want to see in it, Dr. Dawes.
It's simple. We need an honest declaration of how many ventilators were donated, how many were actually commissioned, how many are currently being used, and how many are in disrepair or never commissioned. That's all we're asking. So the numbers that matter are how many are working out of the total donated.
And which institutions, no doubt, they're assigned
to. And which institutions, so people can know exactly where they are. Now, I'd mentioned today the PROMAC program, because PROMAC was set up to not only increase the availability of antenatal care and neonatal care in health centers and hospitals, but specifically to provide high dependency unit beds for mothers and neonates at several hospitals. And we know exactly, based on the request for quotes for the the contracts, expression of interest for contracts, which hospitals should have these HDU beds and exactly how many beds should be there. So that is a benchmark, a starting point, because this was a fully funded program, almost $4 billion provided by the European Union. So we should have had HDUs for mothers and babies at several institutions, such as Mandeville Regional Hospital, Victoria Jubilee, Spanish Town Hospital, St. Anne's Bay, and Cornwall Regional, along with Bustamante Hospital for Children. So in that audit, we have to look and see how many of these HDU spaces are actually functional, in addition to knowing the numbers of ventilators, because a ventilator does not include, having a ventilator does not make it a high dependency unit. But funding was put in place for HDUs in these institutions, and we want to know if they're still up and running and how many ventilators separately are in the public health system.
One of the things the minister said when we were having that discussion about that tragic death of the baby is that there wasn't a ventilator, that there was a ventilator at the hospital, but it wasn't for newborns. So again, is that kind of a disaggregation that we also need?
I don't like to speak to specifics, but if we're going to speak to a specific instance where Mandeville should have been the receiving hospital, there should have been 6 neonatal beds if the PROMAC program was implemented and maintained. 6 neonatal beds at Mandeville Regional. Now, when you have a ventilator, as I said, it does not equal an HDU. But if you have the proper circuitry, you can set up a temporary HDU, and that buys some time until you transfer the patient.
All right, stick up in for me. I want to make sure my listeners are following. Can you explain to us what you mean when you talk about HDU, high dependency unit?
High dependency units are a step down from an intensive care unit, meaning that you won't have the same level of sterility and monitoring, but it is a dedicated room where you have a critically ill patient who has intensive monitoring as well as ventilator and support services to keep them alive if they're in organ failure, etc. So that is a step down from an ICU. Now, we have been using recovery rooms in operating theaters as makeshift HDUs for a very long time. As a matter of fact, in some instances, you operate on a patient and they're in theater and you can't take out that tube, that breathing tube for them. You leave them on the theater ventilator until you can transfer them out. And all you do is just cancel surgeries and understand that that patient is being kept alive by being on that anesthetic machine. But it is what you have and what you just have to work with. And the anesthetists are the ones who are pretty much functioning as the intensivists in those instances. Does that work? Absolutely, yes. And it works because you are using that to temporarily keep that patient alive until you can move them to a proper HDU or ICU. And in many instances, what is not known is that when you don't have an ICU space available at KPH or UA or even Cornwall, what happens is that that patient is housed in the recovery room of the operating theater. So we, Jamaican doctors, nurses, hospital staff, have been taking them hand-turn fashion for a long time. What we should have been doing is to actually increase the number of properly outfitted high-dependency units rather than having recovery areas functioning as HDUs and ICU spaces, because you just don't have enough ICU spaces. And in many instances, what happens is that the staff are forced to make a tough decision. You have a young person or you have an elderly person, both needing ICU care. You're going to have to say the older person has lived their life. We're going to try and save the younger one. And that happens so often when you hear that elderly relatives or friends die because they can't get into ICU. It is because a judgment call has to be made to go for a younger person who has a greater chance of recovery. These are the tough choices that our staff in these institutions have to be facing every day. It's almost as if it is battle or wartime surgery that or medicine that you're dealing with.
The government's response is that, look, we've had problems in the healthcare system for a long time, but they're actually now, they say, making serious investment. The minister said May Pen, we've heard the announcement, Spanish Town in Montego Bay and so on. So the government's response is that we are addressing the concerns being raised.
You can address the concerns, but how you address the concerns is what really will make a difference. I have said it before, over and over again. Building fancy buildings will not solve the problem. The problem is that you have systemic issues, whether it is maintenance. The $11 billion capital budget this year for the Ministry of Health, if you had put that money into a proper maintenance program, all of those donated ventilators from the first EU donation with the ProMax program to the second EU PSOG and private citizens donation during COVID, you would have the majority of those ventilators up and running. You would have X-ray units, ultrasounds. You would have CT scans in hospitals where stroke victims and accident victims, etc., can access these studies. But what they have been doing to try and solve the problem is that they have been trying to outsource. So what happened is that with the public-private partnerships, instead of trying to develop the capacity of the public health sector, they're using money to pay for investigation at market price, not even well-negotiated deals, at private institutions. So what you have done now is to shift the problem from an availability of equipment, which could have been solved by properly addressing maintenance, to the availability of ambulances, because ambulances now become transport vehicles to these private facilities. So you'll hear the stories about people waiting for days to get an ambulance to go get a CAT scan to diagnose their stroke before they can initiate treatment. And that has happened a lot of times. Now, the other thing that this creates is that you have overcrowding because people are waiting to get through this bottleneck to go to these private facilities. So if you put the funding that you have now, and it's a significant increase in funding, if you put that funding into fixing the systemic gaps, it makes a big difference in terms of the delivery of care. And that is what we're saying, and we have been saying, and people who are on the ground in the hospitals and clinics have been saying for the longest time, fix the problems that we have now, rather than saying that you're going to outsource. And now there's this this new magic bullet that, oh, well, we're going to lease all of these equipment that we need for the hospitals, and that is going to solve the availability of diagnostic equipment. But what about buying the equipment yourselves? You will have it for perpetuity or until it breaks down, and investing in the people who are there to fix those equipment and do preventative maintenance, so that it will become more cost effective than leasing out a machine from a private entity.
It's
just a matter of priorities and opportunity cost.
Let me squeeze in a question from a listener before I let you go. Howard in Portmore on our WhatsApp line 5535908. Howard says, as a formal maintenance manager, I'm confused. The information Dr. Dawes is calling for is what is expected from any normal functioning organization. So,
yet it is not available. It is not readily available. They have been trying to get this information for the last couple of days. And every time they have put out a number, that number has been incorrect.
And we have Josephine St. Catherine saying there needs to be an independent audit on this ventilator issue. It can't be left to the Ministry of Health to audit itself. Then we're going to cry out about the validity of the audit. If the PM is so invested in this matter, he should see to an independent audit. Does that make sense to you?
Well, as I said, the numbers have been changing so much that what may happen is that they may just commission a bunch of ventilators that have been that have been in boxes and say, yes, these are ventilators that are working, just to boost the numbers.
Well, I mean, you're suggesting dishonesty there, which we have no reason to think that the PS et al. would behave dishonestly, though?
Well, I'm not accusing anybody of dishonesty, but I do know that the numbers that were put out were not necessarily the numbers that were provided.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that.
All right. And we have to leave it there. We appreciate your time as always, Dr. Dawes. Thank you so much. Dr. Alfred Dawes is the opposition spokesperson on health and wellness.